What happens when a navy that bragged about its unsinkable swarm tactics meets an enemy that simply refuses to fight fair? Because in the early months of 2026, Iran found out the hard way. And what happened next was not a battle. It was a wipeout. Before we go further, hit that like button right now, not for me, but for the sailors and analysts whose work this story is built on. Subscribe if you want the full, uncut version of modern naval warfare. No myths, no propaganda. And share this with one friend who still thinks Iran's navy could ever stand toe-to-toe with the United States. Let's get into it. For decades, Iran told the world a very specific story. It said, "We don't need big ships. We don't need aircraft carriers. We don't need what America has." Instead, Iran built something different. A navy split into two separate forces. One was the regular Iranian navy, built for open water, long patrols, and traditional missions far from the coast. The other was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, Corps Navy, a completely different kind of force designed only for one narrow stretch of water, the Persian Gulf. That second force is the one people talk about the most. Iran called it a deterrent. Outsiders gave it a nickname that stuck, the Mosquito Fleet. Picture more than 1,000 small, fast attack boats, some barely bigger than a fishing skiff, all armed with rockets, guns, and in some cases, anti-ship missiles. These boats could not fight a battleship head-on. That was never the plan. The plan was to swarm, send dozens of small boats at a single warship from every direction at once, overload its radar, overload its decision, making and strike before the bigger ship could respond to everything at once. For years, this idea scared a lot of naval planners. On paper, it looked terrifying. Picture an American destroyer worth $2 billion trying to track 40 small boats coming at it from every angle in the tight, shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, where there is barely room to maneuver. Add midget submarines hiding near the seabed, naval mines scattered along shipping lanes, and coastal missile batteries hidden in caves along the coastline, and Iran's strategy started to look like a real headache for the most powerful navy on Earth. Even the geography seemed to work in Iran's favor. The Persian Gulf is not deep, open ocean. In many places, it is shallow enough that a giant supercarrier has to move carefully, like a truck driving down a narrow alley instead of a wide open highway. That kind of water limits how much a huge ship maneuver, and it gives small, low, fast boats places to hide, tuck behind islands, blend into busy shipping lanes, and disappear into the clutter of ordinary fishing traffic until the moment they choose to strike. Add to that the sheer number of boats Iran could throw into a single fight, reportedly rehearsed in drills involving dozens of vessels moving together in coordinated attack patterns. And you can understand why so many war games and defense reports treated the Mosquito Fleet as a genuine nightmare scenario rather than a bluff. For over a decade, tense encounters in the Gulf kept that fear alive. Iranian speedboats had shadowed American warships before, sometimes coming dangerously close, sometimes broadcasting threatening messages over open radio channels. Daring American crews to make the first move. Each of those incidents ended without a real battle, but each one added to the sense that Iran's small boats were a wild card nobody could fully predict. That reputation followed Iran into 2026, and in some ways, it made what happened next even more shocking. Then came February 2026. That month, a joint American and Israeli military campaign began. It was called Operation Epic Fury, and its first most brutal target was not Iran's air defense, and it was not Iran's missile program. It was Iran's navy. Brutal target was not Iran's air defense, and it was not Iran's missile program. It was Iran's navy. Destroying both the Iranian Navy and the Revolutionary Guard's naval force was named a top priority of the operation from the very first day. Here is where the story gets interesting, because Iran had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of fight. And in the opening days, it barely got the chance to use any of it. Here is where the story gets interesting, because Iran had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of fight. And in the opening days, it barely got the chance to use any of it. Many of Iran's ships, including its largest and most valuable vessels, had not moved or scattered before the American strikes began. They were sitting in predictable, fixed locations, especially at the naval base of Bandar Abbas, exactly where satellites had been watching them for weeks. It is one thing to build a clever, unconventional strategy. It is another thing to actually use it when the moment arrives. Iran built the Mosquito Fleet to sting a slow-moving giant. But when the strikes came, most of Iran's most important ships were not out stinging anyone. They were parked at the dock. Within days, the damage was staggering. Strikes on the naval bases at Bandar Abbas, Konarak, and Bandar Anzali tore apart the core of Iran's conventional surface fleet almost immediately. Frigates that had taken years to build domestically, ships with names like Jamaran, Sahand, Zagros, Dana, and Dalaman, all part of Iran's proudest homegrown warship class, were destroyed. Older frigates from the Alvan class were hit too. Patrol corvettes, forward operating support ships, And even a converted vessel that Iran had turned into a makeshift drone carrier were all struck in a matter of days. That drone carrier deserves a moment on its own. Iran had taken a container ship and rebuilt it to launch and recover attack drones at sea, a clever workaround for a country that could never build a real aircraft carrier. Iranian state media tried to claim their forces had successfully hit the American carrier USS Abraham Lincoln with a ballistic missile. The United States military flatly denied it, stating that the only carrier actually struck in the entire exchange was Iran's own drone carrier, the Shahid Bagheri. Think about how big that gap is. One side claims a major victory. The entire exchange was Iran's own drone carrier, the Shahid Bagheri. Think about how big that gap is. One side claims a major victory. The other side calmly points out that the only carrier that actually got hit belonged to the side making the claim, USNI News. By the first week of March, American officials were reporting that more than 20 Iranian ships had already been taken out as part of the effort to sink the fleet, and the number kept climbing. Central Command later confirmed that more than 30 Iranian naval vessels had been destroyed since the operation started. That was already a historic loss. But it did not stop there. As the weeks went on, the tally kept rising until later reports described something almost unheard of in modern naval history. Around 60 Iranian warships sunk in total, alongside strikes on Revolutionary Guard positions near the Strait of Hormuz. Stars and stripes, tiny 45, 60 warships. Let that number sit for a second. Most countries in the world do not even own 60 naval vessels combined. Iran lost that many in a matter of weeks. All right. Before we go deeper into how this actually happened and why Iran's famous swarm tactics barely got a chance to work, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me which part of this story surprised you the most so far. It helps this video reach more people who need to see the real picture, not the version wrapped in propaganda. Now, back to the story. So how does a navy with more than 100 vessels, backed by decades of asymmetric planning, lose 60 ships without ever really landing the knockout blow it had promised for years? Part of the answer is timing, and part of it is intelligence. Before the first missile ever launched, the United States had already quietly repositioned its most valuable assets. The carrier strike groups built around the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford had already slipped out into open water, well clear of the immediate danger zone, before the first alarms even sounded. That single decision mattered enormously. Iran's entire strategy depended on hitting expensive, high-value targets sitting close to shore. If those targets are gone before the fighting starts, half of the plan collapses before a single shot is fired. Meanwhile, Iran's own fleet did the opposite. Instead of scattering its ships into the open ocean, where they would be harder to track and harder to hit all at once, many stayed in port. Naval analysts who tracked these things using open satellite images had already warned, days before the strikes even began, that Iran's largest ships were sitting still in known locations. That warning turned out to be exactly right. There's also a deeper problem hiding underneath all of this, and it has nothing to do with missiles. It has to do with geography and command structure. Iran's naval power is split between two organizations that do not always work smoothly together, the regular Navy and the Revolutionary Guard's naval branch. Together, their combined fleet included more than 100 vessels, a mix of submarines, frigates, destroyers, and fast attack boats. On paper, that sounds like serious strength. In practice, coordinating two separate naval commands during a fast-moving, high-pressure crisis is enormously difficult. When the attacks came in from multiple directions, air, sea, and even drones, Iran's ability to respond in a unified way broke down quickly. And this is where the Mosquito Fleet's biggest weakness gets exposed. Swarm tactics only work if you actually get to swarm. They depend on hundreds of small boats moving together, coordinated fast and unpredictable, converging on a single target before that target can react. But if your command centers, communication networks, and radar stations get hit first, your swarm has no direction. It becomes hundreds of fast boats with nowhere organized to go. Think of it like a boxer who trains for years to land one perfect, overwhelming combination of punches, only to have someone break both of his arms before the bell even rings. The punches were never the weak point. The setup was. Iran's swarm was never going to be beaten boat by boat in a fair fight. It was beaten before it could even organize itself into a swarm at all, by strikes on the radar stations, the command posts, and the coordination centers that were supposed to turn 1,000 small boats into one coordinated weapon. That is roughly what happened in the Gulf of Oman. Before the fighting even reached its second day, Iranian naval forces stationed east of the Strait of Hormuz had been completely pushed out, with none of the 11 warships that had been there before the conflict still remaining in the area. A force that once patrolled that stretch of water confidently was gone within 48 hours. Now, Iran did not just sit back and take it quietly. On February the 28th, the same day the operation launched, Iran struck back. It fired missiles directly at the headquarters of the United States Navy's Fifth Fleet, located in Manama, Bahrain. Smoke rose over the surrounding district as Iran carried out the strike in direct retaliation for the American and Israeli attacks. And for a moment, it looked like exactly the kind of dramatic escalation Iran had promised for years. The idea that the entire Fifth Fleet could be drowned in its own home port. But here is the twist. While the base that houses the Fifth Fleet's headquarters did take real damage, the fleet itself came through largely unharmed, because its most valuable ships were never sitting there waiting to be hit. The dramatic moment Iran had built up in its own propaganda for years turned into a single loud strike on a mostly empty target. It made headlines. It made for dramatic footage. But it did not change the outcome of the war at sea. This is a pattern worth remembering. Modern naval power is not just about missiles and ships anymore. It is about knowing where the enemy actually is before you commit your best weapons, and knowing where your own valuable assets need to be before the enemy commits theirs. Iran lost that information war before the shooting war even really got started. All right, we are getting deep into this now, so if you want the rest broken down clearly without getting lost in military jargon, make sure you are subscribed and drop a quick comment with your home country. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now let's talk about what happened underwater, because that part of the story is just as brutal. Iran's submarine force was supposed to be one of its trump cards. Dozens of small vessels known as Ghadir-class midget submarines, cheap, hard to detect in shallow coastal water, and built specifically to threaten shipping lanes and hide near choke points like the Strait of Hormuz. Alongside its handful of larger Kilo-class submarines bought from Russia, Iran's underwater fleet was also placed high on the priority target list from the very beginning of the operation. Submarines are supposed to be the ultimate insurance policy in naval warfare. They are hard to find, hard to track, and even a handful of them can force an entire enemy fleet to slow down and move cautiously. But that insurance policy only works if the submarines actually get to sea before the fighting starts. Reports from later in the operation described something almost unbelievable for a modern conflict. Every single one of Iran's submarines was eventually accounted for as destroyed. A force built around stealth and unpredictability. Never got the chance to disappear into deep water and become the threat it was designed to be. By the spring, the United States moved from simply destroying ships to actively controlling the water around Iran. A full blockade was put into effect, aimed at choking off Iran's ability to move oil through the region, and enforced specifically around the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that a huge share of the world's oil has to pass through. To make that blockade stick, dozens of American warships were pulled into the region, at one point representing something close to half of the entire United States Navy's ships actively anywhere in the world. That is an enormous commitment of resources, and it tells you something important. Even after wiping out most of Iran's navy, the United States still felt it needed overwhelming force just to keep the water under control. Winning the fight and controlling the aftermath are two very different challenges. Stars and stripes. And the war did not stop there. Strikes on Iran's naval assets continued for months. In one notable moment in the summer, American forces struck yet another Iranian missile catamaran, a fast, twin-hulled corvette armed with long-range anti-ship weapons and advanced radar-guided air defense systems, following a brutal stretch of days in which the lead ship of that same class was sunk, and a sister ship was left burning at sea near one of Iran's main naval bases. These catamarans were supposed to represent Iran's more modern answer to traditional warships, Fasti. Air, harder to hit, and packed with better missiles. By the time the dust settled on that string of strikes, Iran's advanced missile catamaran fleet had reportedly been reduced to only 3 or 4 vessels still capable of operating. Even Iran's naval drones did not escape. Later in the summer, one of Iran's fast attack boats, the Ghadir, was destroyed while sitting at its pier in Bandar Abbas, hit by a trio of American uncrewed surface vessels, marking the very first time the United States had used armed sea drones in actual combat. Think about the symbolism there. Iran built its entire naval identity around small, cheap, unmanned-style thinking, drones, midget subs, swarming boats, and in the end, it was America's own uncrewed drone boats that helped finish the job on the water. As the year wore on, the picture had become almost impossible to argue with. A campaign that had started at the end of February would eventually stretch on for roughly 10 months of continuous operations, forcing American ships and crews that had been deployed since the very beginning to finally be rotated home and replaced. Even with the strain that long deployment put on the American fleet, the outcome for Iran's navy was not really in question anymore. What had once been described as a real, credible deterrent in the Persian Gulf had been reduced to scattered wreckage, burned-out hulls, and a handful of surviving vessels too damaged or too outmatched to do much more than sit in port. And Iran did not simply accept the blockade quietly. In the early stages of enforcement, American forces intercepted several. Commercial vessels attempting to move oil in violation of the blockade, and in some cases used direct force, including gunfire and precision missile strikes aimed at engines and rudders, to physically disable ships that refused to comply. This was not a clean, bloodless blockade. It was an ongoing, tense standoff, playing out one tanker at a time. So here's the real question worth sitting with. If Iran spent decades building a navy specifically designed to survive and even thrive against exactly this kind of American power, why did it collapse so quickly and so completely? Part of it comes down to a simple, uncomfortable truth. Asymmetric warfare, the whole idea of using cheap, small, unconventional weapons to beat a bigger enemy, only works as a surprise. It only works when your opponent does not fully understand your capabilities, your positions, and your intentions. By 2026, the United States had spent years watching Iran's Mosquito Fleet, its midget submarines, and its missile catamarans. Analysts had mapped Iranian naval bases down to individual piers. Satellites had tracked ship movements for weeks before the first strike. The element of surprise, the single most important ingredient in Iran's entire strategy, had already been stripped away long before the shooting started. The other part comes down to something even more basic. Numbers of ships do not win wars. Coordination does. Information does. And knowing exactly where to strike first before your enemy can react does. Iran had more than 100 vessels on paper, but paper strength means very little when your command structure is fractured, your best ships are sitting in fixed locations, and your enemy has already mapped every base you operate from. There's also a broader lesson here that stretches far beyond Iran. The story of America's own naval decline is part of this picture too. The United States Navy once listed thousands of ships during the height of its power, and even decades later during Vietnam, it still counted hundreds. Today, that number has shrunk dramatically, down to a fleet that, even after a modest rebound decades ago, now sits at a fraction of its historic size. A shrinking fleet stretched across the entire globe. Fighting one, sustained regional campaign for the better part of a year, still managed to essentially erase an entire enemy navy. That should tell you something about just how wide the gap in capability really is, even when raw ship counts alone might suggest otherwise. Other countries are watching this closely, and not just out of curiosity. Several nations around the world have leaned on the same basic idea Iran did, that a smaller navy can offset a bigger one through cheap missiles, fast boats, and unpredictable tactics instead of expensive warships. What happened to Iran's fleet in 2026 is now sitting in the middle of every serious conversation about that strategy. It is proof that the idea is not wrong, but it is also proof that the idea only works if it is executed with real discipline, real dispersal, and real unpredictability, not with your best ships parked at a familiar pier while satellites quietly count them from above. But do not mistake this story for a simple, one-sided beatdown with no complications left behind. Even with most of its surface fleet gone, Iran still maintains more than 1,500 small, fast attack boats capable of high speeds in tight coastal waters, along with more than 20 smaller mini-submarines armed with torpedoes and mines, built specifically for stealth ambush attacks in shallow water where larger warships struggle to maneuver. The big, symbolic ships are gone. The dangerous, low-cost, hard-to-detect threats scattered along the coastline and hidden under the surface have not fully disappeared. That is exactly why the region remains tense, why blockades still require dozens of warships to enforce, and why sailors on patrol in the Persian Gulf still cannot fully relax, even after 60 enemy warships have already gone to the bottom of the sea. If this kind of deep, honest breakdown of modern military conflict is what you come here for, this is the perfect moment to subscribe, and I mean it this time, because we are about to land the final point, and it is the one that matters the most. Here is what this entire story really teaches us, once you strip away the missile counts and the ship names. Iran spent decades building a strategy around the idea that a smaller, cheaper, more unpredictable force could humble a giant. For a long time, that idea genuinely worried military planners around the world. It forced the United States Navy to think differently, train differently, and prepare for a fight that did not look like anything from the 20th century. But strategy without preparation is just theory. And when the moment finally arrived, when the missiles actually started flying in February 2026, Iran's ships were not scattered, hidden, and ready. Many were sitting exactly where satellites had been, watching them for weeks. Its command structure could not keep pace with a war unfolding across sea, air, and drone strikes all at once. And the one dramatic counterattack it did manage to land, the missile strike on the 5th Fleet's headquarters in Bahrain, hit an almost empty target because the fleet's real power had already quietly sailed out of reach days before. By the time the smoke cleared, Iran had lost something close to 60 warships, frigates that had taken years to build, submarines, meant to vanish into the deep. a converted drone carrier that represented years of clever improvisation, all of it gone in a matter of months. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every headline about Iran's navy. Numbers do not win wars. Positioning does, intelligence does. Knowing exactly where your enemy is standing before they even know you're watching, that does. Iran built an entire navy around the idea of ambush, and in the end, it was Iran that got ambushed. The Persian Gulf is quieter now, but it is not at peace. Wrecks still sit on the seafloor near Bandar Abbas. Blockade ships still patrol the Strait of Hormuz, and somewhere along that coastline, the survivors of the Mosquito Fleet are still out there, smaller in number, but not gone completely. The story of Iran's navy in 2026 is not just a story about ships and missiles. It is a story about what happens when a strategy built for a different era finally meets a war it was never truly ready to fight. And that is the real ending here. Not a dramatic explosion, not a headline, but a quiet, sinking realization that sometimes the fleet you spend decades building to fight smart ends up being the fleet that never even gets the chance to prove it. Every empire, every military, every nation that ever believed its cleverness alone would be enough has learned some version of this lesson the hard way. A plan is only as strong as the moment you actually get to use it. Iran had the plan. Iran had the boats, the submarines, the missiles, and the years of drills. What it did not have, when it mattered most, was the one thing that turns a good plan into a real victory, the element of surprise, and the discipline to protect it. Once that was gone, the rest of the story wrote itself, one sunken hull at a time. If this story hit you the way it hit me while researching it, do not just scroll away in silence. Like it, subscribe. Share it with someone who needs the real picture instead of the loud one, and I will see you in the next one.